All right. So the evolution unit is divided into two parts. It is microevolution and macroevolution. We are actually going to take two separate tests. So you get two at-bats taking an evolution test. The things we want to think about are that microevolution is very like genetic based. We talk about the gene pool and alleles and something called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation, whereas macroevolution is looking at big picture evolutionary changes. I would argue that macroevolution is a little bit more accessible, so we're going to try to do the microevolution stuff first, get through it, and really feel successful on the macroevolution stuff. The history that you do need to know about evolution, this one we've talked about quite a bit in your previous science classes. Hopefully, Charles Darwin is credited with proposing the mechanism for the process of evolution. It's called natural selection. So natural selection is what drives evolution. He spent about 5 years basically sailing around the world. He spent a lot of time in South America, and he ended up in the Galapagos Islands. He published a book called On the Origin of Species, and it was basically looking at how when one species ends up in different locations, how they will start to evolve into separate species. He basically established is that all species of life have descended from common ancestors, and he proposed that evolution resulted from a process called natural selection, which was basically the process of certain organisms dying out because they are not successful, and certain organisms surviving, reproducing, and adding to the gene pool. So he basically, by 1870, the scientific community and general public accepted that evolution was a fact, but there were a lot of competing explanations for why and how evolution occurred. But evolution and Darwin's scientific discovery still persist to this day. These were Darwin's observations that we should know. Populations change over time because we can observe this through the fossil record. We can see that there are similar species, but they look slightly different and they are different aged fossils. There are always more offspring produced than the preceding generation, aka populations are always growing. They will reach a cap when they hit their carrying capacity. Populations, if left unchecked, grow at a geometric rate rather than an arithmetic rate. Basically, they will grow exponentially instead of logistically. Think back to what we learned about population growth. He uses the example involving elephants to illustrate the points above. Basically, he claims that if elephants underwent unrestricted reproduction, that over the course of about 800 years, it'd be 19 million elephants if we started with just 2. We obviously know that this is untrue because of all of the limiting factors that the environment provides for elephants. Right, this is kind of the connection between what we talked about with population and now with Darwin. Right, we see that the blue is the exponential model. This is not realistic, whereas the pink is the logistic model, which is much more realistic, right? We'd say that about 400 is the carrying capacity, right? We see that the pink line kind of peters off at about 400. The observed number is what we might see in a real population, and what we know is that it's actually not a very nice curve in either example. It kind of goes up and dips back and forth quite a bit. So this is Darwin's kind of summary of that. We don't need to worry about this. Hopefully you understand what I'm talking about at this point. Other things that Darwin observed that we need to know. He observed that there's variation within a given species, and the majority of this is inherited. From the color of the coat pattern to height, right? This is variety within the species, and it's all inherited. Any variation, right, all of these different variations, to some degree affect the ability of an organism to reproduce and contribute to the gene pool or to survive, therefore affecting its evolutionary success. Now we would say that like height and hair color and eye color, although those are variations, don't really impact our success and our ability to pass on our genes as much, but there are certain things about us as humans or other organisms that will. Species change over time. These changes are related to traits that are inherited or arise from the alteration of genetic code. So over time, species are going to respond to a different change in the environment. Some inherited traits are beneficial and contribute to survival. So some of my traits allow me to survive and pass on my genes. And whether a trait is beneficial or not is a function of the environment which it lives in. So the environment that we live in dictates whether or not our traits are beneficial or not. If I were to move environments, my traits that were negative in one environment may become beneficial. So this leads us to talking about adaptations and fitness. An adaptation is a genetically controlled trait that is favored by natural selection. So this is the trait that makes me more successful and more capable of passing on my genes through reproduction. That is not to be confused with adapting to a situation, right? Because we know those traits don't change. If I'm born with a certain hair color, that's my hair color. If I'm born at a certain height, that's my height. Those are adaptations only if they make me more successful. When we talk about the idea of success, we scientifically refer to that as fitness, or evolutionary fitness. Basically, this allows the individual to survive longer, increasing their reproductive rate, therefore increasing the amount of genetics it contributes to the next generation. Examples of this: the antelope hare in the desert, they have very large ears. That is a trait that allows them to survive and persist, be more fit for the environment, and therefore pass on their genes. They do not grow larger ears. They are born with genetics that allow them to have bigger ears. The snowshoe hare has very small ears. This helps them retain heat because you lose a lot of heat through your ears because it's very thin tissue. The effect of environmental change. So the Earth's environment is not static, but the genes that I am born with are. My genes cannot change. As a consequence, traits or adaptations can be favorable or unfavorable, but I have no control over that. The environment will determine if they are favorable or unfavorable. The very common one that you need to know for the AP test is the peppered moth. It's a native to England, and it exists in two forms. So there's two variations. It is either born black or it is born speckled. Birds will eat it. During the Industrial Revolution, only 2% of the moths were dark, or that's prior. During the Industrial Revolution, they made a ton of smog, a ton of sulfur dioxide and soot, and basically it covered the trees in this black powder. The moths could not change their color, but what did happen is those black moths became more fit, meaning they survived, they reproduced, adding their black coloration genetics to the gene pool. 50 years later, 95% of the moths were dark. Okay, they did not change their color. They were just able to survive. They were more fit. They had that black adaptation, and they passed on their genetics. We call this industrial melanism. Okay, and this is an example of that. How do we define evolution? Evolution is defined as a change in the inherited characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. Evolutionary processes give rise to diversity at every level of biological organization, from molecular to macroscopic. Basically, what we're trying to say is evolution is a change in what the genetic pool looks like. It is not me adapting to my new environment. It has to do strictly with how the genes look within the gene pool. Microevolution is strictly a change in gene frequency within a population. Okay, evolution at this scale can be looked at year to year. Basically, for example, when we talk about pests, some pests have a gene that makes them resistant to pesticides. They can survive, and so when a pesticide is sprayed, they will survive and pass on their genes. When we look at their offspring, the number of organisms with that pesticide-resistant gene will be higher than the ones without because all the ones without died off. And that is what is important here. Other things to know about microevolution: a gene is a sequence of DNA that specifies a particular protein or polypeptide chain and therefore impacts one trait. So genes code for proteins, and those proteins end up creating a certain trait. An allele is a particular form of a gene. So when we talk about big A, little a, or big B, little b, when we start talking about Punnett squares, we know that there's different varieties of that one gene. The gene codes for hair color, for example. The different alleles are black hair, blonde hair, red hair, brown hair. The phenotype is the physical characteristics, while the genotype is that allele in the genes. Natural selection acts on individuals, but only populations evolve, so only looking at their total genetic pool. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is evolution on the scale of separated gene pools. We want to look at accumulation of changes which results in speciation, or the form of a new species. And so when we look at macroevolution, we're looking at 50 years down the road, how has a species changed? We're still looking at genes, but we are looking at like big picture, how have they changed? And how have they maybe speciated or created a new species? Other terms that I've been throwing around a little that you need to know: species, a group of interbreeding organisms that produces viable and fertile offspring. So for example, when we think about species, a mule, which is a cross between a donkey and a horse, is infertile. So technically a mule is not a species. Gene pool is the sum of all genes in a given species. So all of the available genetic material within that species. And the allelic frequency is the percent occurrence for a given allele. So the gene pool for height in the human population, right, that's all of our genes. The allelic frequency would be the percent of people, 6 foot and up, people 5'5" to 6 feet, people, etc. Hopefully we get the picture. Where do these sources of genetic variation come from, right? Because they have to start from somewhere. The two most common types are mutations. These are usually like passive and not negative mutations. They will create a new trait that can be passed on. The other way is meiosis and sexual reproduction, because we know when we create eggs and sperm, there is a lot of dividing of genetic material and recombination. We will talk about meiosis a lot later, and so it creates a lot of new combinations of traits that we may never have seen before. Types of mutations that we need to know. Most mutations are recessive but also negative, which means that they will either kill you before you are born, or they are recessive, so they are hidden by the dominant trait. So you may have a mutation, but they never show up. Obviously, mutations occurring in somatic cells don't affect future generations. So mutations, like if I get mutations in my skin cells, maybe a cancerous skin cell, I can't pass that on. I could only pass on the genetics that maybe indicate that I'm going to get that through my eggs. Right, so only mutations occurring in gametes affect future generations. Point mutations. So these are the different types of mutations that you need to know. Point mutations occur when one nucleotide is substituted for another. And a nucleotide is a single letter. When we look at DNA, we know it's split into codons, which are sets of 3 letters that code for an amino acid, that code for a proton. Changing a single letter usually doesn't have a huge impact, and so we call it a synonymous or a silent mutation. Basically, there's no impact. If there is, we call it non-synonymous or a missense mutation. This is still 1 letter difference, but for whatever reason, this can result in a couple things, but they're called missense or non-synonymous mutations. It can result in a protein that doesn't function as well. That happens the most often. It can mean that we will create a protein that functions better, and sometimes it'll create a protein that functions identical to the same protein. So 3 options for when we see a change that will kind of like impact the DNA. Genes can be duplicated, and occasionally the duplications move a gene from one chromosome to another. This is a big mutation, right? A whole gene moving that can impact the evolution of a species. An example is myoglobin is a protein that binds with oxygen and carries oxygen into the muscles. This gene has been duplicated and modified many times, and it gives rise to the hemoglobin gene, which is what carries like iron and oxygen in our blood. Naturally evolving proteins. I'm actually going to pause here. We'll pick this up in the next video.